Evolution is usually a slow process, but some people are in a massive rush to hit the reset button. We've curated 10 individuals who looked common sense directly in the eye and spat in its face. These aren't tragedies, they're tutorials on what not to do. Fasten your seatbelts. The bar for survival just got lower. 1. Every July, the ancient cobblestone streets of Pamplona, Spain, transform into a kinetic river of adrenaline, cheap sangria, and pure animalistic terror. But for our protagonist, let's call him Javier, the centuries-old tradition of fleeing for one's life was simply too analog for his high-definition tastes. It was a sweltering morning, the air thick with the smell of nervous sweat and the impending thunder of hooves. And while thousands of sane individuals were preparing to run away from the danger, Javier was preparing to frame it. You see, Javier was a man afflicted with a thoroughly modern disease, the inability to experience reality unless it was mediated through a 4K screen. He wasn't just an adrenaline junkie, he was a content creator with 12 followers and a delusion of grandeur. A man who believed that if a tree falls in the forest and nobody livestreams it, it didn't actually make a sound. His logic, if we can stretch the definition of that word until it snaps like a dry twig, was that the standard running of the Bulls footage was too shaky, too impersonal, and frankly, too focused on the backs of people's heads. He needed the reverse angle. He needed the bull's eye view. So, as the rocket signaled the release of the bulls, Javier committed to a strategy that would have baffled evolutionary biologists and physics professors alike. He decided to run the entire course backward. Now, let's pause for a quick lesson in biomechanics. The human body is designed to move forward. Our eyes are on the front, our toes point forward, and our knees bend that way. Running backward is a skill reserved for defensive backs in football, or people retreating from awkward conversations, not for outrunning a herd of 6 angry bovines, each weighing as much as a compact sedan and possessing the temperament of a chainsaw. But Javier was confident. He held his smartphone up like a talisman of protection, the screen acting as his only rearview mirror. As the thundering herd approached, the crowd screamed, not in excitement, but in a frantic attempt to warn the man who was treating a stampede like a cinematic tracking shot. Javier, however, interpreted these screams as adoration for his bravery. He was framing the shot perfectly, ensuring the lead bull, a massive beast named El Matador, for reasons that were about to become very apparent, was in focus. The optical stabilization on his phone was working overtime, smoothing out the vibrations of his own imminent demise. He was so focused on the composition, on getting that perfect rule of thirds alignment of the bull's horns, that he completely forgot about the basic variables of velocity and distance. You simply cannot run faster backward than a bull can run forward. It is a mathematical impossibility. The gap closed with terrifying speed. Through the lens, the bull looked magnificent, a juggernaut of muscle and rage. In reality, it was a freight train with horns. Javier didn't trip, he didn't stumble, he simply ran out of runway. The footage, which was later recovered by authorities, shows a beautifully lit, steady shot of the bull's snout filling the frame, followed by a violent, chaotic blur as biology collided with technology. The half-ton animal didn't even slow down. It introduced Javier to the pavement with the force of a hydraulic press. He captured the most spectacular, terrifying, up-close video in the history of the festival, a clip that would have undoubtedly gone viral had he been alive to upload it. Instead, the video ends abruptly, a digital tombstone for a man who valued the resolution of the image over the integrity of his internal organs, proving once and for all that in the game of man versus beast, the one looking at a screen always loses. 2. Deep in the frozen heart of Siberia, where the winters are long enough to drive anyone to madness and the vodka flows cheaper than bottled water, 2 best friends, Dmitry and Sergey, decided to challenge the apex predator of the taiga with nothing but scrap metal and bad engineering. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Thursday. Time loses its meaning when you are welding steel plates in a garage at 30 degrees below zero. And these 2 backyard inventors had convinced themselves they had solved the age-old problem of human fragility. Their creation was the Ursus Mark I, a homemade armored snowsuit that looked less like a protective garment and more like a torture device from the Middle Ages welded to a dumpster. The logic was undeniably Russian. If a bear bites you, it hurts. Therefore, if you are covered in half-inch steel plating taken from an old boiler, the bear cannot bite you, and you win. It was a simple binary equation that ignored roughly 1,000 other variables, primarily gravity, inertia, and the concept of whiplash. Dmitri, the designated test pilot, and the man with slightly less common sense, donned the suit. The process took 2 hours and arguably required a winch. Once inside, he was essentially a canned human, encased in over 200 pounds of steel, padding, and hubris. He looked like a budget version of Iron Man, if Iron Man had been designed by a committee of drunk tractors. The plan was to head into the woods, find a brown bear, which in this part of the world is like trying to find a pigeon in New York, and test the suit's integrity. And find one they did. A massive male, groggy from hibernation, and generally annoyed by the existence of these two metallic intruders. Sergei, standing a safe distance away with a camera and a flare gun that probably wouldn't work, gave the signal. Dmitri, moving with the grace of a rusted refrigerator, approached the beast. He shouted, he waved his steel-clad arms, he effectively rang the dinner bell. The bear, confused by this shiny, shouting turtle, accepted the challenge. It lunged. And here is where the genius of their design actually held up. The bear's claws raked across the chest plate with a screech that sounded like a train derailment, but they didn't penetrate. The bite, capable of crushing a bowling ball, slid off the reinforced neck guard. Dmitri was laughing inside his helmet, screaming, "I am invincible!" But the bear, realizing that it couldn't open the can, decided to simply discard it. With a casual swat of its massive paw, a motion that for the bear was like brushing away a fly, it shoved Dmitri. In a normal snowsuit, Dmitri might have stumbled. But Dmitri was wearing an anchor. The center of gravity of the suit was somewhere around his knees, and once he began to tip, physics took the wheel. He toppled backward, not onto the soft snow, but toward a small, steep ravine they had neglected to factor into their battlefield risk assessment. As he fell, the weight of the suit accelerated him like a bobsled. He hit the edge of the ravine and tumbled down. The armor did its job perfectly. It didn't dent, it didn't break, and it didn't bend. It remained completely rigid. Unfortunately, Dmitri's neck did not. When the 200-pound suit came to a sudden, jarring halt at the bottom of the gully, the inertia carried Dmitri's head forward while his body remained pinned by the steel. Snap. The silence that followed was broken only by the confused huffing of the bear, who peered over the edge, decided the shiny rock wasn't worth the effort, and lumbered away. Dmitri had built the perfect bear-proof suit, creating a shell so impenetrable that it became his own indestructible coffin, successfully protecting his body from the bear but failing to protect his life from gravity. 3. We've all been there, staring in the mirror, scrutinizing a pore that is invisible to the naked eye, wishing for a magic eraser to wipe away the imperfections of life. But for a woman in Guangdong named Li, this universal vanity metastasized into a fatal, chemical obsession. Li was a woman who viewed the warnings on cleaning products not as safety guidelines, but as challenges to her ingenuity, merely suggestions for people who lacked her vision. She had a major family event coming up, a wedding or a reunion, the kind of high-stakes social gathering where judgment is served as the main course, and she needed her skin to look not just good, but translucent. Store-bought creams, amateur hour, dermatologists, scammers in white coats who just want your money. Li decided to take matters into her own chemically burned hands. Her reasoning was terrifyingly simple. If product A cleans well and product B cleans well, then product A plus product B must equal super clean. It is the kind of logic that makes chemists wake up screaming in the middle of the night. She retreated into her bathroom, a small tiled chamber with the ventilation capacity of a sealed Tupperware container, and began her great experiment. On the counter sat her ingredients: a jug of industrial-strength bleach, the kind used to sanitize hospital floors, and a bottle of ammonia-based heavy-duty cleanser. Now, anyone who paid attention in high school chemistry, or perhaps just read the back of the bottle, knows that mixing bleach and ammonia is the domestic equivalent of summoning a demon. It creates chloramine gas, a toxic vapor that attacks the respiratory system with the ferocity of a mustard gas attack in the trenches of World War I. But Lee didn't smell danger. She smelled potency. She poured the liquids into a bowl, stirring the bubbling, noxious brew with a sense of triumph. As the mixture began to fizz and release a pungent, invisible cloud, she didn't recoil. No, she leaned in. She interpreted the immediate burning sensation in her eyes and throat not as her body screaming, "abort mission," but as the active ingredients penetrating her pores. It's working, she probably thought, right before her lungs decided to resign. She applied the mask, taking a deep breath to center herself. That breath was her last mistake. The chloramine gas seared her lungs instantly, turning the moisture in her respiratory tract into hydrochloric acid. She didn't even have time to scream. The gas hijacked her nervous system, sending her into immediate shock. She collapsed on the cool bathroom tiles, the miracle mask still reacting on her face, foaming slightly as if mocking her bad decision. Her family found her hours later, and indeed, her skin was pale, a haunting, lifeless white caused by severe chemical asphyxiation. The police report noted that the bathroom was so toxic that the paramedics had to wait for the fire department to vent the room before they could even enter to pronounce her dead. Lee had achieved her goal of eternal, flawless stillness, proving that while beauty may be pain, stupidity is lethal, and some reactions are better left to the periodic table than the vanity table. 4. There is a specific, sacred, unspoken contract between a street performer and their audience on the Venice Beach boardwalk. The performer agrees to do something incredibly dangerous or incredibly stupid, and the audience agrees to offer polite applause and maybe a wrinkled dollar bill that has been in a sock for 3 hours. But in the case of a sword swallower we'll call the Great Regret, this contract was voided by a fatal clause involving an ego the size of a tour bus and a temper shorter than a burning fuse. Our setting is a bustling tourist trap, the kind of place where the air smells like deep-fried dough, ocean salt, and bad life choices. The Great Regret was midway through his act, the undisputed king of the sidewalk. Now, we need to clarify something about sword swallowing. It isn't a magic trick. It is a biological hack where you voluntarily suppress your gag reflex, a reflex designed by millions of years of evolution specifically to keep you from dying. To slide a 20-inch blade of cold, unyielding steel past your heart and into your stomach. It requires Zen-like focus, absolute stillness, and a throat that is essentially an open, relaxed corridor. But on this fateful afternoon, the crowd contained a variable that the Great Regret hadn't calculated for: a heckler named Gary. Gary was the type of guy who thought his commentary was a public service, a man fueled by 3 overpriced margaritas and a desperate need to be the main character. As our performer tilted his head back, opening his esophagus like a pelican accepting a fish, and began to slowly sheath the blade into his own torso, Gary decided this was the perfect moment for some improv comedy. He shouted something uninspired, likely a crude joke about the performer's dating life or the authenticity of the blade. In a rational world, the performer would ignore this. He would finish the trick, bow, and maybe glare at Gary later. But the Great Regret was an artist, and artists are sensitive souls with fragile vanity. With the hilt of the sword resting on his lips and the sharp tip hovering dangerously close to his stomach lining, rage took over. He forgot the golden rule of his profession: when you are a human scabbard, you do not talk. Enraged by the disrespect, he instinctively tried to shout back, to deliver a scathing retort that would silence Gary forever. But here is the physics lesson for the day. Shouting involves the rapid, violent contraction of the diaphragm and the jagged movement of the larynx. When there is a rigid steel bar occupying that same space, the anatomy has nowhere to go. As he convulsed to scream, "Shut up!" his internal organs collided with the unyielding metal. It was a massacre from the inside out. The sharp movement caused the blade to slice laterally, severing arteries and causing a fatal internal laceration that no amount of backstage first aid could fix. He collapsed on the boardwalk, the sword still hilariously, tragically protruding from his mouth like a metallic tongue, silencing him far more effectively than Gary ever could. The crowd gasped, thinking it was part of the finale, a dramatic death scene to close the show. It wasn't until the ambulance arrived that the reality set in. Gary, the heckler, went silent, likely for the first time in his life. The great regret had died for the sake of a comeback, proving that while sticks and stones may break your bones, words, specifically the ones you try to shout while impaled, will absolutely kill you. 5. We need to have a serious, uncomfortable conversation about the Disneyfication of nature, a modern delusion where urbanites genuinely believe that wild animals are just fuzzy humans in costumes waiting for a musical number to start. This brings us to Brenda, a woman in the Pacific Northwest who didn't just drink the Kool-Aid, she marinated herself in it. Brenda was an avid consumer of animated movies where princesses sing to birds and deer help with the laundry, and she decided she wanted her own magical moment of interspecies connection. She wasn't satisfied with just seeing wildlife through binoculars like a normal person. She wanted to be accepted by the forest. She wanted to be the queen of the woods. So, during a solo camping trip deep in grizzly country, a place where the park rangers carry shotguns and the signs effectively say, "You are food," Brenda concocted a plan that was equal parts sweet and suicidal. She believed that animals respond to pure intentions and sweet scents. To facilitate this spiritual meeting, she decided to turn herself into a walking, talking dessert buffet. She smeared organic honey all over her tent flaps, and in a stroke of genius that defies all survival instincts, covered her own clothes in chunky peanut butter. She sat down outside her tent, closed her eyes, and waited for the rabbits, the chipmunks, and maybe a gentle doe to approach her for a cuddle. She was manifesting a scene from a fairy tale. Unfortunately, she manifested a grizzly bear. Now, a grizzly bear does not care about your aura. It does not care about your spiritual journey or your Instagram engagement rates. A grizzly bear cares about calories, and Brenda had just transformed herself into the highest calorie object in a 50-mile radius. She smelled like a beehive, and a nut factory had a baby. The bear didn't approach with a song in its heart. It approached with saliva in its mouth. When Brenda opened her eyes, expecting to see Thumper the rabbit, she was instead face-to-face with 800 pounds of apex predator who couldn't believe its luck. To the bear, this wasn't a woman. This was a pre-seasoned, marinated snack that had arguably prepared itself for consumption. There was no magical communication. There was no singing. There was only the brutal, efficient reality of the food chain. The attack was swift, driven by the scent of honey and the promise of protein. When the rangers found the site later, they were baffled. They had never seen a campsite that looked so much like a crime scene in a candy shop. The official report noted that she had essentially seasoned herself for the kill. Brenda had achieved her goal of becoming one with nature, but she did it in the most literal, digestive way possible, serving as a grim reminder that while nature is beautiful, it is also hungry, and it prefers its meals without the artificial sweetener of delusion. 6. In the pantheon of bad party tricks, few are as dangerous or as scientifically misunderstood as the glass-shattering voice trick. But for Isabella, a woman in Italy whose competitive streak was rivaled only by her lung capacity, it was a hill she was willing to die on, literally. The setting was a high-end dinner party in Milan, the kind where the wine costs more than your car and the egos are fragile. As the night wore on and the Pinot Noir flowed, the conversation turned to opera and vocal power. Isabella, who was not a trained opera singer but possessed the volume of a jet engine and the stubbornness of a mule, boasted that she could shatter a crystal wine glass with her voice alone. The other guests, sensible people who understood physics, laughed and bet her she couldn't. This was Isabella's "hold my Chianti" moment. She grabbed a priceless, hand-blown crystal goblet, an heirloom that had survived 2 world wars but was about to meet a foe it couldn't defeat: human idiocy. She took a deep breath, puffed out her chest, and began to scream. It wasn't a note, really. It was a weaponized frequency, a high-pitched shriek aimed directly at the rim of the glass. But crystal is resilient. It vibrated, it hummed, but it refused to break. Most people would stop, take a breath, maybe laugh it off and admit defeat. But Isabella was in the zone. She refused to breathe. She refused to stop. She pushed harder, turning a shade of purple that isn't found in nature, straining every muscle in her neck until her veins looked like garden hoses ready to burst. She was effectively performing the Valsalva maneuver, trying to exhale against a closed airway with the force of a hydraulic pump. She was building up an immense amount of intracranial pressure, turning her own head into a pressure cooker. The guests stopped cheering and started looking concerned. "Breathe, Isabella!" someone shouted. But Isabella could not hear them. She could only hear the ringing of the glass and the roar of her own pride. She gave one final earth-shattering push, forcing air that wasn't there through cords that were shredded. And then, pop. A sound finally happened, but it wasn't the tinkling of broken crystal. It was the wet, tragic sound of a major blood vessel in her brain, giving up the ghost. She had triggered a massive, catastrophic aneurysm. She collapsed onto the table, knocking over the glass she had tried so hard to destroy. The irony, thick enough to cut with a knife, was revealed in the silence that followed. The crystal glass rolled off the table, hit the hardwood floor, and didn't break. It remained perfectly intact, mocking her from the ground. Isabella had won the bet on volume, but she lost the game of life, proving that while the human spirit is unbreakable, the human vascular system is surprisingly delicate when you treat it like a bagpipe. 7. In the blistering heat of the Arizona desert, where the sun is less of a celestial body and more of a personal enemy trying to kill you, lived a man named Cliff. A name that, in hindsight, feels like a cruel foreshadowing from the universe. Cliff was a sovereign citizen of the sandy soil, a man who viewed utility companies not as service providers, but as oppressive overlords trying to steal his precious bodily fluids and track his water consumption for the CIA. He was obsessed with the idea of living completely off-grid, a noble goal that he approached with the engineering knowledge of a hamster and the unearned confidence of a drunk structural engineer. Cliff decided that paying for city water was a scam invented by Big Aqua, so he would dig his own well, by hand. In the shifting sands of the Sonoran Desert. Now, anyone who has ever played in a sandbox knows that sand has a very specific physical property. It hates to stand up straight. It is essentially slow-moving water made of rocks. But Cliff, armed with a shovel, a bucket, and a stubborn refusal to watch a single YouTube tutorial on shoring, began to dig. He dug for weeks, descending into the earth like a sweaty, conspiracy-theorizing mole, eventually reaching a depth of 30 feet. To support the walls of this vertical death trap, he didn't use concrete casings or steel rings. He used scrap plywood and pallet wood he found behind a grocery store, bracing them with the structural integrity of a house of cards. He was effectively building his own coffin and digging the grave simultaneously, saving the coroner a lot of legwork. On the final day of his life, Cliff was at the bottom of his pit, scraping away at the damp earth, convinced he was moments away from striking the sweet nectar of freedom. He looked up at the tiny circle of blue sky, feeling like a king of the underworld. But physics, which had been patiently waiting for him to make a mistake, was about to stage a coup. The vibrations from his own digging caused the dry, unstable sand halfway up the shaft to shift. The structural pallet wood snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Cliff barely had time to look up before the desert decided to reclaim him. It wasn't just a few rocks. It was tons of sand, clay, and gravel, collapsing instantly, filling the shaft with the speed of an hourglass turned upside down. There was no air pocket, no time to scream, just an immediate, crushing embrace by the very land he claimed to love. The police report noted that the rescue team didn't need a ladder to get him out. They needed a heavy-duty excavator and a map. Cliff had achieved his ultimate goal of becoming one with the land, merging his carbon with the silicon of the desert in a permanent, crushing union, proving that while you can live off the grid, you cannot live under the dirt without a permit and a basic understanding of load-bearing walls. 8. In a quiet, lace-curtained suburb of England, a widow named Beatrice was dealing with grief in a way that would make a therapist slowly close their notebook, back out of the room, and change their phone number. Beatrice was convinced, through a logic that can only be described as grief-induced psychosis, that her late husband, Arthur, had been reincarnated. Not as a majestic eagle or a loyal dog, but as Cuddles, her 18-foot, 200-pound Burmese python. To be fair, the resemblance was uncanny. Both Arthur and the snake were cold-blooded, mostly silent, bald, and prone to lying on the couch for 18 hours a day without moving. Beatrice treated Cuddles not as a reptile with a brain the size of a peanut and the predatory instincts of a dinosaur, but as a spouse. She cooked for him. She talked to him about the neighbors. And, in a violation of every survival rule written since the Stone Age, she slept with him. Every night, the massive constrictor would coil up in the bed beside her, and Beatrice would drift off, comforted by the embrace of her husband. Friends warned her. Experts warned her. Even the snake, through its dead, unblinking eyes, seemed to be confused by her lack of fear. But Beatrice insisted that when Cuddles stretched out next to her, he was snuggling. Biology, however, tells a different, much darker story. Snakes don't snuggle. They thermal regulate and seek prey. Cuddles wasn't spooning. He was enjoying a heated mattress pad that smelled like food. On one fateful, silent night, the primal switch in Cuddles' primitive brain flipped from roommate to hunger. Perhaps Beatrice moved too much in her sleep, mimicking the distress of a dying animal. The python did what constrictors are designed to do by millions of years of evolution. He didn't bite. He hugged. He wrapped his massive, muscular coils around her chest, initiating a lethal embrace that Arthur, in his human life, never had the upper body strength to perform. Beatrice woke up, but only for a terrifying few seconds. The pressure was immense, instantly stopping her lungs from expanding. There was no struggle, no scream, just the silent, efficient work of a predator securing a meal. By the time the neighbors found her days later, Cuddles was resting contentedly, having realized that while he could kill the prey, he lacked the opposable thumbs to open the bedroom door. Beatrice died in the arms of the one she loved, a tragic victim of the misunderstanding that just because something has a heartbeat doesn't mean it has a heart. 9. Paranoia is a powerful drug, and for Mrs. Higgins, a resident of a sleepy English village where the biggest crime was usually a stolen garden gnome, it was a lifestyle. Mrs. Higgins was convinced she was being followed by them, a shadowy, undefined group of pursuers who wanted her secret recipe for sponge cake or perhaps state secrets she didn't actually possess. She watched too many spy movies and slept too little, leading her to conclude that the local postman was a sleeper agent and the milkman was a spy. Deciding that the local police were likely in on it, she resolved to take matters into her own hands. She would turn her front yard into a fortress. Her pièce de résistance was a trap straight out of a Wile E. Coyote blueprint. She spent 3 nights digging a pit in her garden, a hole 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, right in the path to her front door. To ensure them wouldn't escape, she lined the bottom with broken garden pots and rusty tools, a homemade punji pit. She then meticulously covered the gaping maw with thin plywood, scattered dirt, and arranged dead leaves and branches until it was perfectly camouflaged. It was a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare. She went to bed that night, chuckling to herself, waiting for the scream of an intruder. But them never came. The only thing that arrived was Monday morning. Mrs. Higgins woke up, groggy and needing her tea. She heard the mail slot clatter. The morning paper. Routine is the enemy of vigilance. In her bathrobe and slippers, thinking only of the headlines and her Earl Grey, she opened the front door and stepped out to retrieve the news. Her brain had completely deleted the Dig Giant Death Trap file from its short-term memory. She took 3 steps, and the ground, which she had personally engineered to fail, did exactly that. The plywood snapped with a crack that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Mrs. Higgins plummeted into her own abyss. She didn't just fall, she fell onto the jagged security measures she had installed for her enemies. The fall broke her neck instantly, a quick, confused end to a life of worry. She was found later by the postman, who was arguably the only person actually stalking her house, albeit to deliver coupons for cat food. Mrs. Higgins had successfully caught the only person who was ever a danger to her, herself. She died in her own trap, a tragic monument to the fact that if you spend your life digging holes for others, you'd better remember where you put them. 10. There are hobbies, there are obsessions, and then there is the peculiar madness of Civil War reenactors, a group of men who look at the bloodiest conflict in American history and think, you know what this needs? More wool and less dentistry. Meet Jefferson, a man from Virginia whose passion for historical authenticity was so intense, it should have been classified as a mental illness. Jefferson wasn't content with just wearing the uniform or eating hardtack. He needed the power. He belonged to an artillery unit and had spent his life savings on a replica cannon. But for Jefferson, replica was a dirty word. He wanted the boom to be real. Against all regulations and sanity, he modified the barrel to fire actual solid-shot projectiles, turning a prop into a functioning siege weapon. On the day of the battle, his target was a derelict barn about 500 yards away. He loaded the black powder, rammed the ball, and lit the fuse. The cannon roared, smoke filled the air, but there was no impact on the barn. The recoil felt wrong, soft, sluggish. Jefferson, a man who understood 1860s fashion better than 2020's physics, assumed there was a blockage or a squib load. Now, the cardinal rule of gun safety, from a Glock to a howitzer, is do not look down the explodey end. Jefferson treated this rule as a suggestion for cowards. Frustrated by the failure of his artillery, he grabbed a heavy iron cleaning rod and marched to the front of the cannon. He peered directly into the smoldering, blackened maw of the barrel, his face inches from the muzzle, trying to see the obstruction. He didn't realize that deep inside the barrel, an ember from the cheap powder was still glowing, slowly cooking off the unburnt residue. As he shoved the cleaning rod in to feel for the blockage, the rush of fresh oxygen and the friction acted as a detonator. Boom! The cannon didn't fire a cannonball this time. It fired the iron cleaning rod. The rod, moving at supersonic speed, didn't just hit Jefferson, it canceled him. It passed directly through his head, removing his hat and his capacity for thought in a millisecond, before continuing on to impale a hay bale 50 feet behind him. It was a tragically authentic death. Countless soldiers died in the 1860s due to equipment failure and operator error, and Jefferson had successfully reenacted that specific, gruesome statistic to perfection. He died doing what he loved, ignoring safety protocols in a wool coat. Be honest in the comments. What is the single stupidest Darwin Award moment you actually survived as a kid? We all did something idiotic that should have killed us. Jumping off a roof with an umbrella, eating mystery berries, or poking a socket. Confess your near-death sins below. Subscribe before you try it again.